been guilty, cheating on my lovers, but I don't mess around no more. Because I finally found the lady that means everything. I promise I will never break her heart. This time I'll be committed, and that's what I'll be. I found my angel, I found my star. You know you're truly something special, and I'll keep you right here in my heart, baby. And you know I'm sincere. You know you're truly something special, and I'll keep you right here in my heart, baby. And I'll hold you so dear to me. Yeah. I can be good as any other, but I've been bad for so long, yeah. I wanna be good, your one and only lover, and I want you to keep me strong. There are no indecisions, I made up my mind. You're the only girl for me, yeah, yeah. It's time I started listening to this heart of mine. I finally found the girl of my dreams. Girl, you know you're truly baby. Oh, girl, you need to know I'm something special, and I'll keep you with me, baby. Yeah, and I'll hold you so dear. I wanna know, do you wanna go with me, babe? Come on and marry me, babe. This time we'll be true, and I'll wait for you. Girl, you know you're truly special, and I'll keep you right here in my heart, baby. You're truly something special, baby. Yeah, I wanna keep you in my heart, baby. And I'll hold you so dear. Yeah, yeah. I can be good. I wanna be good. You're one and only. And can you keep me strong? I know I've been bad for much too long. Now I'm sincere. I'm gonna keep you right here in my heart, baby. And I'll hold you so dear to me. Yeah. You know you're truly special, and I'll keep you right here in my heart, baby. 'Cause I know you gotta know me. Know I'm sincere. Yeah, yeah, special, and I'll keep you right here in my heart, baby.
Okay, we'd like to welcome everyone to this year's McKeesport Senior High School 1994 Promenade. This year's Promenade is Midnight Memories and Ivory Dreams. The first couple this year is Mr. Sean Bozer, and he's escorting Miss Beverly List. The next couple is Minor Rodriguez escorting Allison Hudson. Our next couple is Jen Callio escorting Delvon Simmons. Our next couple is Mr. Steve Kovac escorting Miss Stacy Whiteman. Our next couple is Mr. Ron Elfer escorting Miss Brandy Jones. Our next couple is Mr. Jeff Holden escorting Miss Brittany Ohm. Our next couple, Mr. Keith Nelson escorting Jody Muha. Our next couple, Mr. Bob O'Dorsick, and he's escorting Miss Tammy Hilty. Okay, we had a correction. This couple is Mr. Bob O'Dorsick, and he's escorting Miss Tammy Hilty. The last couple up there was Mr. Adam Dimio, and he was escorting Miss Carrie Riterchik. Our next couple is Mr. Joe Barton escorting Miss Natalie Pavlik. We're having a problem. It seems that the names are a little out of order, so you're gonna have to bear with me right now.
That was Joe Barton and Natalie Pavlik. Next couple was Dave Bajusik and Shelly Ray. Don Davis escorted by Ron Gusky. La Quinta Pose escorted by Dion Johnson. Jim Rose escorting Jen Jove. Malin Burgess escorted by Brian Gribble. Scott Wisser escorting Trisha Moeller. Amy Tarsala escorted by Sean Ruby.
Okay, our next couple is Mr. Bruce Dry, and he's escorting Miss Agnes Tack. Next, we have Steve Vidovich and Jen Benjock. Our next couple is Mr. Steve Bradley, and he's escorting Miss Michelle Miller. Our next couple is Mr. Alan Tuttle, and he's escorting Miss Becky Wassel. Our next couple is Paul Holtzman and Miss Erin Antonsik. Up next, we have Mr. Brian Miller, and he's escorting Liz Jordan. Our next couple is Mr. Steve Estoshin, and he's escorting Miss Cassie Enox. Our next couple is Mr. Doug Hetrick and Miss Angie Strang. Up next is Matt Bloom, and he's escorting Heather Potts. Our next couple is Mr. Jake Hayes, and he's escorting Miss Michelle Verbanek. Our next couple is Costa Bonas, and he's escorting Jen Krausmore. Our next couple is Michael Potter and Melanie Pfeiffer. Up next, we have Mr. Adam Marsh and Miss Lori Shaw. Up next, we have Mr. Ron Ondachek and Miss Sarah Bachowski. Our next couple is Mr. Justin Ackerman and Miss Marie Stanesik. Our next couple is Mr. Rashad Kirby, and he's escorting Miss Lorraine Sloan. Our next couple is Mr. Lee Taylor and Miss Tina Twyman.
Since I was 2, they was barefooting. They was barefooting.
Our next couple is Miss Brian Herr and Miss Ruth Friend. Our next couple is Mr. Justin Ingersoll and Miss Nikki Stevens. Our next couple is Mr. Jared Cottom and Miss Jen Coulter. Okay, our next couple is Mr. Andrew Napton and Miss Kim McMillan. Our next couple is Mr. Chris Nowatting and Miss Amy Kessler. Next we have Mr. Tom Lawrence and Miss Lori Jorosinski. Our next couple is Mr. Nick Stone and Miss Hillary Graham. Next, we have Mr. Adam Miller and Miss Emily King. Our next couple is Mr. Larry Bishop and Miss Amy Hocko. Up next, we have the fabulous Mr. John Tedesco and Miss Melanie Beresford. Next, we have Mr. Ron Rutherford and Miss Jackie Moldovan. Our next couple is Mr. Pat Gilchrist and Miss Jessica Lockhart. Our next couple is Mr. Eric King and Miss Kristen Roddy. Our next couple is Mr. Ethan Weiss and Miss Danielle Gallagher. Up next, we have Mr. Tom Santiago and Miss Chrissy Weir. Our next couple, Mr. Matt Commander and Miss Erica Gurgley. Up next, we have Rob LaRocco and Susie Gabala. Next, we have Katine Perrine and Andrea Moore. Next, we have Dan Swearington and Christina Groves. Our next couple is Matt Malone and Tommy Pullock. Next is Aaron Morris and Christy Weil. Chanel Singleton and Brian Christian. Up next, we have Scott Hill and Denise McKinstry. Our next couple is Sean Berta and Janice Potts. Our next couple is Sean Hurley and Kimberly Reynolds. Up next, we have Mr. Chuck Massung and Miss Tina Glinsky. Up next, we have John Brozak and Jennifer Mellinger. Our next couple is Jay Gagoric and Lynn Schramm. Our next couple is Mr. Todd Mulvey and Chris Straniak. Up next, we have Scott Jordan and Jamie Swanson. Our next couple is Mr. Jeff Smerkel and Miss Chris Fenton. Our next couple is Mr. Darren Novich and Miss Tabitha Wilk. Our next couple, Mr. Frank Connick and Miss Erin King. Our next couple, Mr. Chad Urin and Miss Sharon Urick. Up next, we have Mike Lapkowitz and Colby Goodwin. Our next couple, Mr. Adam Nicholson and Miss Megan Holtzman. Our next couple, Mr. Eugene Pacelli and Miss Chrissy Heckman. Our next couple, Mr. Sean Ninna and Miss Carrie Gazdich. Our next couple, Mr. Brandon Cordes and Miss Jamie Babiak. Our next couple, Mr. Mark Rivak and Miss Jamie Patemra. Our next couple is Mr. Todd Sturgis and Miss Natalie LaBarbara. Our next couple is Mr. Doug Morgan and Miss Heather Vavro. Our next couple is Mr. Steve James and Miss Becky Verbanek. Mr. Wayne Paxson and Miss Kelly Nestor. Up next, we have Mr. Kevin Weibel and Miss Kira Miskimen. Our next couple is Scott Sine and Bethany Cormos. Our next couple is Mr. Joe Schmuck and Miss Adrian Dawson. Our next couple is Mr. Jeremy Kraushaw and Miss Lauren Reynolds. Our next couple is Mr. Mike Gerdich and Miss Erica Powers. Our next couple is Mr. Jamie Taylor and Miss Christy Kellerman. Up next, we have Mr. Jason Palacia and Miss Emily Considine. Next is Mr. Tim Barnes escorting Miss Erica Loises. Up next, we have Mr. Ron Morrow and Miss Christy Gerstner. Our next couple is Mr. Jerry McGrew and Miss Heather Lynn. Up next, we have Mr. Dino Malice and Miss Stacy Lust. Our next couple is Mr. Mark Trainer and Miss Colleen Martin. Our next couple is Mr. Rob Heinz and Miss Yvonne Hendrickson. Next is Eric Kurtzanek, and he's escorting Sandra Ernie. Up next is Mr. George Hazaga and Miss Kim Gural. Next is Mr. Mike Como and Miss Angela Gural. Our next couple is Mr. Ron Bishop and Miss Sarah Montanti. Our next couple is Mr. Brendan Schmuck and Miss Michelle Earnshaw. Our next couple, Mr. Chris Gano and Miss Melissa Andrews. Up next is Mr. Marco Ratesic and Miss Joey Pochask. Mr. Justin Giamario and Miss Nicole Donati. Up next, we have Mr. Kevin Seibert and Miss Holly Marco. Up next is Mr. Jason Valenta and Miss Christy DeFleece. Our next couple is Mr. Jeremy Wanless and Miss Amanda Myers. Up next is Mr. Rick Simcanos and Miss Jessica James. Mr. Steve Wargo and Miss Rachel Bush. Up next is Mr. Luke Payne and Miss Susan Mayer. Up next is Mr. Marty Odenthal and Miss Lisa Digga. Our next couple, Mr. Jason Della Penna and Miss Nicole Christie. Our next couple is Mr. Arjuna Roca and Miss Amy Basonic. Our next couple, Mr. Steve Linhart and Miss Mary Slapka. Next, we have Mr. Matt Suckfield and Miss Brandy Pecora. Next is Mr. Josh Prisbala and Miss Debbie Andrews. Next is Mr. Darren Kuhn and Miss Jen Hadikevich. Up next is Mr. Sam Cunningham and Miss Natalie Newton. Next we have Mr. Adrian Scarpari and Miss Stacy Stewart. Up next is Mr. Eric Malarski and Miss Natalie D'Antonio. Our next couple, Mr. Brock Graham and Miss Jennifer Tollner. Mr. Rob Maroney and Miss Chrissy Ciotti. Our next couple, Mr. Lynn Washowitz and Miss Marcia Holtz. Our next couple, Mr. Mike Frizzy, and he's escorting Miss Courtney Campbell. Next is Gary Keener and Stella Kumsatkis. Our next couple is Mr. Matt Zalar and Miss Stephanie Kiefer. Next is Mr. Adam Lindsay and Miss Angela Barrett. Our next couple is Dane Allen and Mozelia Steele. Our next couple is Mr. Scott Peters, and he's escorting Miss Shauna Rucker. Our next couple is Courtney Burney and Misty Andrews. Our next couple is Jess Robinson and Tonda Cash. Is this one? We have the wrong names. Excuse us for 1 second.
Demetrius Diggs and Courtney Richardson.
Demetrius Davis?
Diggs.
Mr. Demetrius Diggs and Miss LaKoya Richardson. Now it's Mr. Jess Robinson and Miss Tonda Cash. Our next couple is Miss Julie Grabowski and Mr. Mike Hagen. Next is Mr. Ed Shaletsky and Miss Heather Garland. Our next couple is Mr. Eric Fowler and Miss Kim Welsh. Our next couple is Mr. Dave Terrell and Miss Lisa Falaski. Our next couple is Terry Acey and E. Keisha Walker. Up next, we have Mr. James McKenna and Miss Susan Guy. Our next couple is Gordon Lucas and Kendra Gleditch. Our next couple is Mr. Chad Anderson, and he's escorting Miss Kristen King. Up next is Mr. Keith Paradise, and he's escorting Miss Brooke Smith. Our next couple is Joe Wetzel, and he's escorting Miss Claire Shiverini. Our next couple is Mr. Justin Short and Miss Jamie Butler. Up next, we have Mr. Andrew Hall, and he's escorting Miss Michelle Haynes. Our next couple is Bob Johnson, escorting Marie Brooks. Up next is Mr. Nathan Kirk, escorting Miss Jody Brewster. Up next is Consuelo Wright and Keelan Rozier. Our next couple is Mr. Eric Harper, and he's escorting Miss Tina Johnson. Up next, we have Miss Kia Marshall and Mr. Jermaine Cromarty. Next, we have Mr. Brandon Short and Miss Tally Watson. Next is Mr. Kevin Irvin and Miss Nikki Gadsden. Our next couple is Mr. Ryan Sturgis and Miss Missy Griever.
Our next couple is Carlos Banks and Dana Bryan. Next, we have Truth Wilson escorting Erica Hayden. Our next couple is Lori Steiner and Dave Schmitz. Our next couple is Unica Williams and David Caldwell. Who's the host?